In sports, you can be a villain in one city, or in this case, entire state, and a hero in another. Here at the AJC, we're counting down 12 sports villains that the city of Atlanta, or in this case, probably all of Georgia, is not fond of. This week's villain was surprised to hear we were including him in the list, but when reminded of his 11-1 record against Georgia as Florida's coach, and the couple upset victories as South Carolina's coach that played a hand in keeping the Bulldogs out of the national championship, the old ball coach ended up taking it as a compliment. He also couldn't resist bringing up that he had a 6-0 record against Georgia Tech as an offensive coordinator and head coach for Duke. Our number 3 villain in Atlanta sports history is Steve Spurrier. I'm joined by our Georgia beat writer, Chip Towers. Chip, what makes Steve Spurrier the perfect Atlanta or Georgia sports villain?
Yeah, wow. I mean, where do you want to start, really? I guess you would start with Florida for sure, because it was really amazing. I don't know how many people nowadays really remember that before Steve Spurrier showed up at Florida, everything was going Georgia's way. He shows up, and then all of a sudden, man, it went the other way big time. And so there was that, and then he goes to South Carolina. You think you're done with the evil genius, as I think was coined by our own Mark Bradley back in the day. You know, he breaks their hearts a couple of times over there too. So you certainly ask any Georgia fan, and they will call him evil. They will call him a villain.
Now, you've covered a ton of Steve Spurrier in your career. What makes him an evil genius when it comes to his coaching?
Well, I think there's two things about it, really. I mean, number one is, if he's on your team, right, if you're a Gamecock or a Gator, you love it. But for everybody else, it was just the confidence. I mean, he knew he was better than you were. And
he wasn't shy about saying it.
Oh, no, he would tell you. He was always, he gigged. He did that all the time, especially when Ray Goff was there, because, Georgia has always recruited really, really well, and they did under Ray Goff, but, Ray Goff could never beat him. And so, he would say in his, Steve Spurrier, well, I don't know what happens to all those recruits when they get to Georgia, and so he knew that he could hurt you off the field as well as on the field. And look, his teams were just fantastic. Those teams at Florida, I'm really the shock when you look at it in retrospect is that they only won one national championship. Now, they won several SEC championships, but they only won one national championship. They were great ball teams.
Let's talk about that Georgia-Florida rivalry and how it's flipped back a little bit. What was it like before Spurrier, and what's it been like post-Spurrier?
Well, if you look at Spurrier's, let's just say his sentiment toward Georgia, it is really, you have to go back to his days as a quarterback there. He won the Heisman Trophy as a quarterback at Florida, and he actually, he wasn't a quarterback of record, but they beat him one time when he was there. But particularly in 1966, they were undefeated. They had never won the SEC championship. They were heavily favored against Georgia. Georgia came in there, and they not only beat them, but they beat Steve Spurrier personally to death. I think it's hard to find records like they are now, but he was sacked 8 or 9 times during that game. But Big Bill Stanfield did a lot of the work at the time. And Bill Stanfield, after that, they both go to the NFL. And Bill Stanfield, who was with the Super Bowl champion Miami Dolphins, used to gig Spurrier all the time about that. You look really good in your tuxedo there at the Heisman thing. Well, what's your record against Georgia? And so he kind of turned that around as soon as he got to Florida. He made a proclamation. This is the game we need to win. This is the game we have to win. If we're going to do what I want to do at Florida, we have to win this game. And he did 11 out of 12 times.
Now, as dominant as Steve Spurrier was at Florida, when he came to South Carolina, he was still a persistent thorn in Georgia's side.
Yeah, a lot of people forget one of the best teams Georgia ever put on the field was in 2007, and they had an early season loss at South Carolina, not by a little bit either. It was 35-7, and that really ended up costing Georgia, who finished number 2 in the country that year, but got left out of all the national championship consideration. But really the one I think about more than any is 2014. They're playing over there in Columbia, and really there wasn't much expected of South Carolina that year. Georgia has Todd Gurley, and they win in a game delayed by a thunderstorm, and Georgia misses a field goal, and they win. And that cost Georgia big time, and ultimately cost Mark Richt big time because he would be fired the next season.
Do you think it's mostly personality? Do you think it's mostly X's and O's, his track record? What makes Steve Spurrier kind of still frustrating for folks in Georgia.
Well, it's both, but I think you got to back up a little bit. He was at Georgia Tech, as he points out to us. I mean,
as he was happy to point out.
Yeah, I didn't realize his record against Georgia Tech until he offered that information to me, and that's really where the fun and gun started. He goes up to Duke. I can't remember the coach that hired him there at the time. It's in the story. Read the story. But but that's where the fun and gun was built. And when he took that to Florida eventually as the head coach, in the SEC, it was largely a run the football, play defense league until that point. Here comes Spurrier spreading it out all over the place, throwing the ball all over the place, not even bothering to run the football. And it took Georgia and the rest of the SEC a long time to adjust to that. It was Florida, Alabama for several years in a row before Georgia finally got back in the mix. Jim Donnan finally beat him in 1997 to break what was the longest streak in Florida history over Georgia.
Wow, Chip, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to all of you for watching. Make sure you continue to follow along as we count down the top 12 villains in Atlanta sports history.